Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Welcome. My name is Karen Tucker, and I am the CEO and a member of the board at the Churchill Club. Our program tonight is entitled WikiLeaks, Why It Matters, Why It Doesn't. And I'd like to welcome our distinguished speakers, starting with Daniel Ellsberg, Clay Shirky, Roy Singham, Peter Thiel, Jonathan Zittrain, and of course our moderator, Paul J. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I would also like to thank our program partner and sponsor, ThoughtWorks. It has been a great experience working with the ThoughtWorks team to develop this program, with some help also from the Real News Network. At ThoughtWorks, we definitely could not have done this without you. Thank you. Hello to all of our viewers watching the live stream on Fora.tv and the Real News Network. The program will be available on demand on those two websites and also on the Churchill Club YouTube channel after tonight. Before we kick off, a few brief announcements about upcoming programs. Next week, on January 26th, we'll be up in San Francisco with another timely panel entitled Location and Privacy, Where Are We Headed?, with speakers from Microsoft, the Federal Trade Commission, Reputation.com, and CDT. And on February 16, we present a Churchill Club Great Debate. Is software patentable? Should it be? And we have speakers there from Fenwick & West, Gabriel Venture Partners, and the Free Software Foundation. And finally, on February 24, we present former Sun Microsystems CEO Scott McNealy in conversation with former Motorola Chairman and CEO and also Sun President Ed Zander. And they're going to be talking about the legacy of Sun Microsystems, perspectives on where the industry is headed, maybe some advice about which database to buy. Probably plenty of surprises. So details of these and other programs can always be found on our website at churchillclub.org. For those of you less familiar with the club, we are a nonprofit, member-supported, unusually lively business and technology forum with 7,000 members. We're now celebrating our 25th year. And if you're not a member already, please do consider joining us and enjoy the benefits that come with membership, including special access to more than 30 programs every year. And my last announcement, if you're tweeting this evening, please do use hashtag Churchill Club so that everybody can follow along. And now it's my privilege to introduce our moderator, Paul J. Paul is CEO and senior editor of the Real News Network, which is a nonprofit organization that he created in 2005 to create uncompromising global news. Paul has been a force in the Canadian media for over 20 years. He is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and is currently working on a feature documentary film called Report from the Middle East. Paul's films have been shown on television around the world through groups such as A&E, Turner, BBC, and CBC. But not content with just documentaries, Paul created and was the executive producer of CBC Newsworld's daily flagship debate programs, Face Off and Counterspin, which for 10 years were the primetime Canadian national debate shows about the news of the day. And we're very happy to welcome him back to our stage at the Churchill Club. Please give your warmest welcome to Paul J.
This far too long an introduction for me, because one of the things we're going to try to do tonight is not have very long introductions, because as one of the local newspapers said, we have a stellar panel, and it really is, the brain power on this stage is enormous, so we're going to try to make as much room for people to speak from the panel as possible. This topic we're dealing with is an issue of rights, and I think that's going to be the theme that will run through the evening. The rights of government to keep secrets, the rights of people to know what their government is doing, the right to have transparency. In the most recent case with WikiLeaks, the issue of foreign policy. Does government have the right to carry on a foreign policy that's publicly one thing and in reality something else? And do the people have a right to know that? It's also an issue about private companies. When do private companies have the right, or do they always have the right, to put commercial interest first, meaning if you get a call from a senator, in the case of this specific situation, Senator Lieberman's staff, we're told, calls Amazon, whether it's coincidental or not, because Amazon claims that phone call did not lead to Amazon taking down WikiLeaks, but they did, and they weren't the only company that took down WikiLeaks. The right of a private company to say, this is in our commercial interest, not to get into a war with a senator. And the right of public discourse on a platform that's primarily privately owned. What happens to public discourse when it's all moving to the internet, but the internet is delivered primarily by private companies? So what do we do about that? How will the public interest be defended there? But it's also very much an issue about whistleblowers. And in this day and age, the only place whistleblowers are really going to get to the public opinion, both in the United States and globally, is on the internet. And right now, there's a fight taking place about that. And there's obviously a very zeroed-in campaign to try to close down WikiLeaks altogether. So to start us off, probably the best-known whistleblower in the United States, and certainly renowned for his courage. And I'm not going to go on and on about him because I promised you no long introductions. Daniel Ellsberg is the former State and Defense Department official, and as you all know, he was prosecuted for releasing the Pentagon Papers. Daniel. So in terms of the significance of the attempt to close down WikiLeaks on the internet, the great amount of pressure to try some way to prosecute Julian Assange, and I believe there's a grand jury deliberating that now. What does your experience teach us?
Well, I had the very unusual experience of being the first person ever prosecuted for a leak to the press or the public in the United States. The act under which I was prosecuted, namely the Espionage Act, had been designed for espionage and had never been used for anything else other than against spies who, with the intent specified to harm the interests of the United States or help a foreign power. My prosecutors did not charge that of me. On the contrary, they used the clause in the Espionage Act, which they're using against Bradley Manning also, and which they would use against Assange if they decide to do it. And that makes no distinction, by the way, in its target. It had never been used, as I say, in connection with a leak or a disclosure of classified information. And the reason for that was really that it had been always understood that that was intended to cover spying, and that we did not want, Congress did not want, an Official Secrets Act of the British kind, which criminalizes any and all disclosure of classified information, of government secret information. And the people working on that act or other proposals by administrations to have an Official Secrets Act, Congress had always rejected that on the grounds that that went against the core of our democracy, the First Amendment, the necessity, if the public is to be in any sense sovereign, it had to be informed, that the press played an essential role in that, and that it was the role of the press to inform the public of information that of the most embarrassing and sensitive kind, namely information about mistakes, errors, crimes, reckless policies, incompetence. The sort of thing that I can tell you as somebody who was in the government is subject to the closest guarding from its political rivals, from the electorate, and from the public. So we've never had an Official Secrets Act. Actually, Congress did pass one in the year 2000, and Clinton vetoed it. Let me ask, how many in this elect audience knew either of those facts? Can I see hands? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, how many did not know either of those? Okay, we would have an Official Secrets Act if Clinton had not been led to veto that act. And it would criminalize what Assange did, it would criminalize what Bradley Manning did, definitely what I did. And actually, it would go a lot further, because the wording of that act, the only act that the government has found to be claimed to be applicable, makes no distinction between officials, press, bloggers, anyone without authorized access to the information, passing it on to anybody unauthorized. And that means, and this sounds absurd, but it's the way it's written, that would mean that any reader of the New York Times reading a story saying this is not a joke, saying this is a classified document to which we've been given access. The reader is not authorized. Passing it to her husband or her child, her sister, whatever, would be passing it to an unauthorized person and just as prosecutable in terms of the wording of the act as an official or a consultant, as I was, or Bradley Manning or Julian Assange or anyone. It could apply to everyone. Extremely broad. It was always assumed that that would be unconstitutional if it were applied to disclosures. And that's why prior to Obama, there were only, in a world where leaks occur every other day, there were 3 prosecutions, of which mine was the first. The third, AIPAC, was dismissed for a variety of reasons. Mainly it's being AIPAC, I believe, but AIPAC. But we would have had to admit that Israel was a foreign country to which they passed the information. And so they didn't want to get him under spying, which otherwise they could have done, 794. But, different act. But only one person has actually been convicted by a jury and gone to prison, Samuel Loring Morrison. So the Supreme Court refused to address that case on certiorari. 2 other people have pled guilty, so their cases didn't go up. The Supreme Court has never actually ruled on whether it's constitutional to put this much material, we're talking billions to trillions of pages of classified documents over the last 60 years, to put that all beyond public discussion, not just by threat of firing or clearance, which is very effective and has kept far too many secrets, but to add to that criminal sanctions. Is that constitutional? The Supreme Court has never yet addressed that. I think that is related to the strange fact that President Obama, who came in promising transparency, who has in fact in the area of national security and homeland security been as secretive as any prior administration, including George W. Bush, and in some ways more secretive, and one way in particular I'm about to mention. I said before Obama there were 3 indictments. Obama has brought 5 in these 2 years. If he brought it against Assange, if they did 6, it would be twice as many as all previous presidents put together. And what's going on here? Well, it's part of a policy of generally use of state secrets privilege, use of against dismissing lawsuits, being totally secretive, not being at all forthcoming on freedom of information in terms of these areas. So it's part of a policy. But why more than others? I'd be interested to hear anybody's suggestion. In fact, I think you were asking me that the other night, Peter. Why is it that Obama is pressing this so strongly? This is before WikiLeaks, remember, except for Bradley. The previous 4 were before WikiLeaks, and 2 of them were for acts undertaken under Bush, which Bush had not indicted. Thomas Drake and Shammai Leibowitz, who's in prison now. So in other words, this "we're not looking back" applies to the myriad crimes of the Bush administration: torture, aggressive war, warrantless wiretapping, crimes that actually strike at the heart of our Constitution as well as our domestic law. No looking back on those. The only looking back is on whistleblowers. Drake and Leibowitz revealing what they thought were great wasteful practices. So there is a war on whistleblowing. To me, and again, why Obama so much, I have a hypothesis. This is just very speculative. I think he feels more vulnerable to whistleblowers than either his predecessor, because he's doing many of the same things. One of the great secrets in the cables released is how little difference there is from 2008 to 2009. They're the same practices, the same torture, not that much difference. But Bush was proud of it. He did it secretly at first. It was all covert at first. But when it came out, torture? We don't torture, but what we do, we do. And I don't apologize for it. NSA warrantless wiretapping? No problem, need it. I think Obama's a little more embarrassed about all that coming out, that he's acting in the same lines, that he has a new war that he's escalating, added to Bush's war in Afghanistan. And he really wants to do what other presidents have always wanted to do, shut down leaks that they don't control, the leaks they don't make. But I think he's really doing it more aggressively than any previous president, and specifically, he's doing it by treating the act that I was charged under as an official secrets act, as an act that criminalizes all leaks. And if he gets a conviction that of any of these people, not just Manning or Assange, if he gets Drake or Kim, if they go up to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court takes it and doesn't notice that it is unconstitutional, which is not a bad bet. Earlier courts would almost surely have called it unconstitutional. This one might not. And if he gets that, he has a very broad Official Secrets Act, and from then on, all he has to do to find out who is the source of any leak, one day to the next, with a clear-cut crime, is to call in the reporter whose byline is on the head of that column and say, we're not charging you with anything, we're not against the press, we're for the press, just who committed the crime. And if the person can't take the Fifth Amendment, he or she is not being charged with anything, they just either tell or they go to jail indefinitely for contempt. Judith Miller lasted 85 days. And some of them will last longer, but a lot of them won't. And from then on, no source will have any basis for assuming or hoping that their name for this whistleblowing will be anonymous. Their only recourse will be WikiLeaks, so WikiLeaks matters.
I should have said in the beginning what the format for this evening is. Each speaker will speak for about 5 or so minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to the panel to question or comment on what the first speaker spoke about. And over the course of the evening, each speaker will get a chance to speak. So I now throw it to the panel. Any questions or comments or argument with Daniel Ellsberg?
I'd like to start by echoing what Mr. Ellsberg has said about the national scope, the previous national scope of all of these leaking cases. I mean, the remarkable thing about the Pentagon Papers case is that the Supreme Court decision there, New York Times versus U.S., all actors were local. You were local, the Times was local, the DOD was local, and local to the United States. And that judgment meant that all of the decisions around the Espionage Act of 1917 could assume American membership of all of the participants and could assume essentially the full scope of the rule of law. What I think is really remarkable about what WikiLeaks has done is that they haven't just internationalized this, the transmission of leaks. They've actually globalized it, by which I mean it's not just happening in another country. It's not just happening in France instead of here. WikiLeaks is actually the first truly multi-homed journalistic organization we've ever seen. And the fact that there is no one place for a government to get its hands around changes things quite dramatically. Because I think that when you look at this situation from the point of view of the leakers, of someone who thinks I have some information about secret wrongdoing that ought to be exposed to the view of the public in a democracy, any leaker who looks at what happened with Judy Miller is not going to take the New York Times view of that, which is we did the right thing, our reporter went to jail, we defended her. They're going to look at it from the point of view of, under those circumstances, the U.S. government was willing to jail someone indefinitely for contempt. And the answer is, do not leak to a source in the same nation as the information is about. And that strikes me as a permanent change. Anyone with a document of any importance to leak, I can't imagine them leaking it to their own national press rather than going through a WikiLeaks-like service and coming back to the national press, simply because of the getting around the very problem Mr. Ellsberg is right.
It's an interesting thing because Canada has a law against the Canadian security establishments tapping phones within Canada. Australia has the same law in Australia, so they traded. Australians listen to Canadian conversations. Canadians listen to Australians' conversations. They both beat their domestic law. Except now what's happening is that non-governmental actors are going to start playing the global game. It's very interesting. Anyone else want to jump in on this before we move ahead?
Well, I do think the question about transparency and it's very interesting how there's this question where the transparency is directed. Is it directed at individuals or at governments? And I think I think we see this even in the Assange case, where on the one hand we have this amount of incredible transparency about what's going on. I found most striking in the Middle East, and the serious risks of a massive escalation in Iran, possible escalation already going on in Pakistan, Yemen, various other places. And so there's sort of a set of transparency related towards making government more transparent. And then, of course, you have all the transparency about Assange personally that's come out, where one suspects that there would not have been nearly as much transparency into Assange's escapades in Sweden had it not been linked to this government thing. And I do think that transparency is an incredibly powerful weapon of sorts, and we have to think really hard how it gets used, and we should distinguish very much between governments and individuals, and this is a very important kind of a thing to do. That and one of the big differences is governments have the power of the state on their side. They can use violence, and we should be following the violence and seeing where it leads. And we should have more of a presumption of innocence with individuals and have more privacy in that sort of a context. So I think that that asking questions, I think we shouldn't simply have a gloss that we're going to have a more transparent world and that's better, or we're going to have less privacy and that's worse. But we have to ask some very tough questions about where the transparency is being increased and how that changes the balance of power between states and individuals.
I had a question, maybe Daniel follows it more closely than I do, but the SHIELD Act that they're trying to push, that I think the House Judiciary, are you following that?
I did follow that, but the no SHIELD Act that's ever been, this is to allow reporters to protect their sources in front of grand juries and in other respects, but no SHIELD law has ever been proposed that would cover the transmission of classified information. So it doesn't actually relate. Actually, Representative Issa, who claimed to be in favor of the SHIELD law and was one of the sponsors of it, I think, is believed to have changed sides on this particular, but he's particularly using the WikiLeaks case, which is absolutely unrelated to the SHIELD Act debate, as an excuse for having kept that out of a vote in the last session of Congress. And it's very unlikely to go ahead in the next session. So he has pretty much killed it. On an excuse. There's no rational basis for it.
But just so the audience knows, the reason my mother came tonight is to see Daniel. I have not been able to see my mother for weeks, but when he came, I got to see my mother tonight. So this is a big honor for the family. But you're the ranking historian in the room. 1971 to today, obviously a big change in landscape of all these different parts of American life. I remember that you weren't so warmly thought of in 1971.
You don't look old enough, maybe.
I warmly thought of you, but I think many didn't. And I, in fact, was watching a story on Martin Luther King. The Washington Post and the Time magazine wrote an article about Dr. King 1 year before he died, denouncing him as a demagogue and all this kind of stuff. It's very interesting how history judges people in context. Fast forwarding, do you think these last 3 years we're at one of those other historic moments? I know Clay thinks, you call this the Amsterdam moment, right? Which I totally thought was brilliant. Clay's a brilliant fellow too. Which, for those who don't remember or don't the story, which was
it was the 1500s. Nobody in the room remembers.
Remember the story, but well, that's true. But the Catholic Church at the time, the Bible was sort of a secret, and publishing was not so cool. And the printing presses of Amsterdam went on strike because of fighting secrecy. And Clay calls this our generation's, the internet generation's historic moment. Do you agree with Clay that that's where we are?
Well, it cuts in several directions. For the behavior of the government, or the attitude of the government towards leakers, there really isn't that big a change. The truth is that it's funny, there is a mantra going up right now lately that Pentagon Papers good, WikiLeaks bad. Ellsberg good, Manning bad. I've never had so many establishment
Let me interrupt just by reading this, an Associated Press report. Even as prosecutors build a case against the Army privates suspected of passing hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables to WikiLeaks, the State Department is promoting a documentary film that celebrates Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg. Amid its struggle to contain damage from the WikiLeaks revelations, the State Department announced Saturday that the film, The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, has been selected as one of 18 films that will tour the world this year as part of its American Documentary Showcase. I hope they don't name a day after you, because that will be the end of it.
They're actually going to take notes on who goes to the film.
Right here.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we're honored with the
So my fondest dream, and that's not rhetorical, it would be the high point of my life, is if this film that the State Department is sending around the world to show a triumph of American democracy, because it really was, the American system other than the executive branch. The rest of it really acted almost unprecedentedly, marvelously, as the Constitution intended at that point. An independent judiciary did, in fact, find the crimes the government had done against me were a reason to drop the case, dismiss the charges. Congress cut off the money for the Vietnam War in the process of that struggle, that legal struggle. Actually, the president's actions against me while I was in trial were key to his charges in the impeachment hearings, which led to his resignation and helped actually end the war. So, this is quite a message for which the people of Tunisia have seemed to have gotten without even benefit of seeing the film, but that actually, and not exactly by constitutional process, but that one can aspire to have a democratic system in which you don't have to get killed by the hundreds in order to change a criminal regime. But on the other hand, the acts for which he was facing, namely, I mentioned earlier, going into my former analyst's office, doctor's office, to get information to blackmail me into silence about new revelations about his administration while I was on power, using the CIA as a secret police against me, doing a domestic profile and helping that burglary, by the way, which was against their charter then, hearing me on warrantless wiretaps, which was illegal then and made even more illegal a few years later as a result. All these things were covert, but they've now become legal under Bush. The warrantless wiretapping and the use of CIA in these matters, the secret police, and so forth. And finally, an effort Nixon had to bring CIA assets, Bay of Pigs veterans, up from Miami to incapacitate Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol. Now, over the last year or so, I've been saying now everything else is now legal, but that one is still illegal. That's in question, very much so. President Obama, through his Director of National Intelligence, Blair, has identified an American citizen who is on a hit list for total incapacitation, Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, far from a battlefield, a civilian, for assassination by special forces units, same kind that were used against me. The difference is, so the actions are the same. The difference is that Nixon did all those things covertly and faced impeachment as a result. Now, they're legal and can be said, this is not a good progression. This is a descent into an abyss, actually. So that doesn't favor where our democracy has gone at all. But finally, and I'll maybe come back to this later, I'll just mention it now. Finally, I feel very great affinity with Bradley Manning because actually for 40 years, I'm often identified with the question, is Daniel Ellsberg like Assange and so forth? I like Assange, I met him, and I respect very much what he's doing, admire on the whole what he's doing, although I think he's made mistakes that I would hope I would not have done, but I think he's learned from them. and is doing better. But the analogy is with Bradley Manning. And for that, I had to wait 40 years. Manning is somebody who said to the guy who informed on him that I am ready to go to prison for life or even be executed. Executed? Seems a little melodramatic, except that Congress people have called for his assassination, if not execution. Either if you can't execute him, if you can't bring him back, assassinate the sources of this. And Bradley Manning is the only suspect so far, but whoever the sources are, they should be assassinated. It really has occurred to me, if Manning were to be tried, he'd have to be tried for treason, and he is no more a traitor than I was, but I was called a traitor by the President of the United States and the Vice President, just like Bradley Manning. Wrongly, stupidly, wrongly. But I heard that too from the President and the Vice President. If he were tried for treason, as people in Congress are asking, if he were executed, he would be the first American to be executed for giving secrets to Americans since Nathan Hale. And he, like Hale, is a guy, I believe, Bradley Manning, who from his own statement and his own actions is ready to give his life in freedom for his country, and that's as patriotic as you can get.
Right. Well, the other question the WikiLeaks drama over the last few months raises is, will there be a place for people like Daniel Ellsberg and Bradley Manning to release their material? On December the 2nd, the Wall Street Journal reported that members of Senator Joe Lieberman's staff called Amazon and asked why they were hosting WikiLeaks. Amazon later, the same day or the next day, took down WikiLeaks from Amazon. They said it wasn't directly connected to anything to do with Joe Lieberman. Lieberman then issued the following statement. This morning, Amazon informed my staff that it has ceased to host the WikiLeaks website. I wish that Amazon had taken this action earlier, based on WikiLeaks' previous publication of classified material. The company's decision to cut off WikiLeaks now is the right decision and should set the standard for other companies WikiLeaks is using to distribute its illegally seized material. I call on any other company or organization that's hosting WikiLeaks to immediately terminate their relationship with them. WikiLeaks' illegal, outrageous, reckless acts have compromised our national security and put lives at risk around the world. No responsible company, whether American or foreign, should assist WikiLeaks in its efforts to disseminate these stolen materials. I'll be asking Amazon about the extent of its relationships with WikiLeaks, what it and other web service providers will do in the future to ensure that their services are not used to distribute stolen or classified information. Later that day, or the next day, I'm not entirely clear on the chronology, but within a day, a company called Tableau Software, which was providing a service that allowed, if people went and saw the WikiLeaks site, they were graphing how many different, which of the cables were most released, so you could see geographically where the cables came from. At any rate, on December 2nd, Tableau releases a statement, why we removed WikiLeaks visualizations. And then the end of the statement says, our decision to remove the data from our servers came in response to a public request by Senator Joe Lieberman, who chairs the Senate Homeland Security Committee, when he called for organizations hosting WikiLeaks to terminate their relationship with the website. So I'd like to ask Clay Shirky, and Clay, just to remind you, is an independent internet professional, adjunct professor, interactive communications at NYU. What's the significance of a senator calling up a privately owned company and kicking off WikiLeaks?
Well, so, I mean, there are so many pieces to that, to Lieberman's action. One of them, obviously, particularly I think relevant in California, the home of the Pruneyard decision, is that it is visibly dramatized the way that the internet is not, in fact, largely a public sphere. It's a corporate sphere that tolerates public speech. And the Pruneyard decision was a culminating decision around a series of arguments about labor and Vietnam protests in malls. And the question was, as in the 1960s, the public space became increasingly corporately owned and managed, to what degree could commercial interests chase out the historic respect for public, essentially public protest in places where other citizens could see it? It was a complicated series of overlapping decisions. But the last one of any real import was Pruneyard, which said essentially that California could have greater requirements of commercial firms to support public speech than the national standard that's been set. And I think at least one interesting illustration from Lieberman and Evgeny Morozov, who I disagree with about quite a lot, but who I think has nailed this one absolutely. Morozov said, up until WikiLeaks, it was possible to imagine that self-restraint on the part of the U.S. government would be enough, that the government would work through legal channels rather than bullying corporate firms. And I think Lieberman has given the lie to that hope for self-restraint. The other interesting thing about Lieberman that I think has been enormously clarifying is that he is one of the few intellectually honest actors in this part of the debate. So, no, seriously, the Lieberman moment was this whole business of Ellsberg good, Manning bad, Pentagon Papers good, WikiLeaks bad, was basically a kind of attempt to wriggle out of the plain ramifications of the Pentagon Papers. And Lieberman said, no, that's not what we mean at all. What we mean is the Pentagon Papers case was wrongly decided. We would like to re-adjudicate it, and we want all media outlets to be punished. And he went on Fox News and said, after WikiLeaks, it would be good if we were to go after the New York Times. So Lieberman gave the lie to the idea that there was any kind of obvious legal or moral difference between the Times as a media outlet and WikiLeaks as a media outlet, and said essentially, we are after a National Secrets Act. And I think the fact that Lieberman's actions demonstrated that Amazon and eBay and PayPal or PayPal owned by eBay, Amazon, eBay, Visa, MasterCard, Tableau, et cetera, could attempt to damage WikiLeaks' ability to distribute content with much less process than it takes to get on a terrorism watch list indicates how vulnerable the current infrastructure for public speech is to that kind of action.
Peter, you were one of the founders of eBay. I'm sorry,
PayPal.
You later sold PayPal, but if PayPal later, after Amazon took down WikiLeaks, PayPal refused to do their transactions anymore. What do you make of this issue of the right of a private company to defend its commercial interest, the right of public discourse, the need of the public to have access to whistleblowers, and to shorten the question, if you'd been running PayPal now, what would you have done?
Well, fortunately, there's always this sort of thing where you don't have to answer difficult moral cases if you're not in a situation. So there are all sorts of people who get placed in very difficult situations where you either do what's right, and which is very courageous often, or you do what may be wrong and it's not very courageous. And most of the time, people end up doing the latter. And fortunately, most of us often do not find ourselves in either of those two situations. And I have not been running PayPal since 2002, and so I did not find myself in that confronted with that personal moral dilemma. Now, what I do think ends up happening in most of these cases is companies will cave, and they will, of course, say that that they are respecting people's rights and the privacy issues, but in practice they cave, and it's sort of companies are to the government like the government is with terrorists. Government with terrorists, the line is always, we never compromise with terrorists. And then there's the unspoken footnote is, except in every specific instance. and companies with the government, it's always, we're going to basically stand up for people's rights, and if you look at the various commentary around the WikiLeaks thing, you've got sort of various forms of corporate boilerplate to that effect. When you peel it back, it maybe doesn't mean quite as much, but then in every specific case, there is incredible pressure brought to bear on companies to cave, and I think there are sort of two somewhat different perspectives I'd offer, and that one is there's obviously this somewhat of a moral perspective where we would like to have absolutely heroic people as CEOs running these companies and saying that we're not going to compromise, and occasionally you get that. And then I think I think, but what I think we also should be trying to bring about is a balance of power that's a little bit different, where there aren't so many hooks that you have to be gone after, and where the penalties are not so extraordinarily high. And we live in a society where there are a lot of laws. It's not clear how they get applied. There's a book I read the other day, 3 felonies a day. The average person in the U.S. commits 3 felonies every single day. And it only takes, a really clever prosecutor to find out. And so, a given company, it's not just an issue with respect to a specific giving the government a right to this thing or that thing. It's likely there are all sorts of areas a company, or an individual for that matter, is engaged in that involves a lot of legally gray zones, because we have a lot of super complicated laws in our country, and nobody really knows what the law is and what it isn't. It's incredibly vague, and it can be used in all sorts of arbitrary ways. And that's why I believe that even though we would like to have very heroic people, the reality is most people, much less most CEOs, are not like Ellsberg. And that's why I think we have to put this in the context of really reducing the power of the state to use violence against individuals and corporations.
How would you do that?
I think that it's not an obvious question.
But within the context of this specific situation, where Amazon says either because they said it because it was their own terms of service, that their reasons for taking down WikiLeaks, they said is WikiLeaks didn't have proof of copyright and things like this.
This is Peter's 3 felonies a day. All terms of service read, we can do anything to you at any time with no penalties. And because lawyers work at $300 an hour, they write it out longer than that. But that's the ultimate effect of all terms of service. So any of us are in potential violation of any terms of service at any moment. This is Peter's point about the interpretation of the terms of service is what Amazon did. It wasn't having the terms of service.
Right.
That was the event.
So what do you do with that? We're a private company, and where the main platform of public discourse now is privately owned, and either for their own reasons or under government pressure, can decide that such a thing can no longer be in the public domain.
Right. The reason I want to know, Peter,
I do think the government pressure thing is the thing that shouldn't be dismissed here, and I think that this acts as an incredibly powerful force that's brought to bear on companies in all these different contexts. There are most companies, especially most larger companies, sort of are entangled with the government in all sorts of different ways, and you do not want to get a reputation as a company that is sort of operating outside the law, because we have a lot of laws and they will be brought to bear against you, and it's somewhat arbitrary how they get brought to bear. And I don't necessarily have a straightforward solution to it, or I don't know what you do. I think having more transparency into it is probably helpful. I think having a less powerful government is probably helpful. And then obviously, to the extent we are supportive of people who take a principled stand, that would also be very helpful. Even though it's the sort of thing where, in principle, you never negotiate with terrorists, except in every specific instance.
Roy, do you want to take your 5 minutes?
So I was actually dying to hear Peter's answer, because I think most of you know he's known as a mild libertarian at times. And to me, I have a lot of libertarian colleagues, and so we have healthy debates. And to me, this is one of those interesting issues. So the Valley, many libertarians live here, many business people here, they don't like government intervention, but to me this is a very difficult issue in my mind for the libertarians to address, right? Because I actually agree with you. I'm very opposed to the power of the current government, how much they have, so we actually have a lot in common. But how is the public, what is the recourse of somebody who's shut down by Amazon in your world, right? So every private company, caves, which I tend to agree with, typically happens, and you can't sue Amazon because they're not the government. The First Amendment doesn't apply to them. So I think there is a big problem that we have created that is unanswered in the Valley.
Well, I think the problem exists because of the power of the state in the background, though. I actually, if you ask, are these companies, and this goes to the question of what Amazon's real motive here is. And is Amazon shutting down access to WikiLeaks or supporting it because that's actually what they believe is in their corporate interest? Or is it because of the power of the state on the background? And that's a very important question you have to answer. And I tend to think the Amazon statement you read struck me as disingenuous. I don't actually believe it.
How many people here think? How many people in the audience think it was an
Amazon
accurate
statement?
assessment of Amazon's theory?
How many people believe that government power was lurking in the background and was encouraging that statement?
Go ahead, Dan.
That's a question. Clay, you're giving Lieberman credit here for, which is fine. It occurs to me that since he is, in fact, consistent enough to say that if you're going to prosecute, that you should prosecute Assange and you should prosecute the New York Times, it is the case, as I was saying earlier, there is no U.S. law that can criminalize anything Assange did that does not apply exactly equivalently to the New York Times. So how about Lieberman's pressure now for extra-legal, extra-judicial pressure? Why isn't he calling for boycotting of the New York Times? And isn't that perhaps the next step? The New York Times is, in fact, putting out... The New York Times actually selected the cables to come out of this. Basically, it's editorial judgment of them. They made the judgment. So if Lieberman is against that and says it's against the law, which his reading of the law would indicate it was, why isn't he also saying that the New York Times should not that anybody who reads the New York Times is supporting an organization that's involved in an illegal activity?
Well, so in this case, I think it may be because soft power will work better than hard power, which is that the Times, on the same day that they published the first Cablegate stories, also had a very long profile of Assange that was tremendously unflattering. This is the John Burns story. Yeah. And the bizarre thing about that story is that, I mean, Julian could drown cats at home in his basement, and it wouldn't change one fact that appeared in those cables. And so going after the person, right, was a way, I think, of the Times kind of propitiating national sentiment. I mean, Julian is a gift to the press, right? He's a monocle and a Persian cat away from being a James Bond villain, so he makes really good copy, particularly if you've got a photograph of him to run. And I think, right, no one ran a similar profile of Curveball, who was by proxy Judith Miller's source when she was putting forward the weapons of mass destruction story in the New York Times. Had someone run that kind of story about Curveball saying we should be skeptical of the sources of these revelations, that, in my view, should have been front page news. Putting the Assange, the tremendously unflattering Assange profile as front page news next to Cablegate was, I think, the Times' way of saying we won't defect as far as we could. And I think Lieberman recognizes that
he wants to prosecute them, though.
He wants to prosecute them, yeah, and he said that, which again is I think I disagree with it, but I think it's intellectually honest. But I think he's also I think there's a hard power argument outside the U.S. Assange is not a U.S. citizen. Iceland is not a U.S. country. As you know, one of the members of the Icelandic government whose tweets were subpoenaed by the FBI tweeted, does the FBI know that I'm a member of the Icelandic parliament?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it was, our ability to reach beyond the borders of the U.S. is constrained, and I think Lieberman is looking for ways to affect that. But I think he's engaged in a game of chicken with the local press, saying, if this is what we can do to a media outlet like WikiLeaks, we'll come for you next. So I think he may feel as you imagine he does. I think he's just not come out with that yet, because I think he may sense the ability to restrain the local press's willingness to report the story simply by going after the novel actors in the situation.
I'm going to take us back to the question we were at just a little earlier. Jonathan Zittrain, am I saying it right?
Yep.
Is a professor of law and professor of computer science at Harvard. He's founder of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. what do we do? There's like a catch-22 here. You have a First Amendment defense if the government tries to close you down, but there's no First Amendment rights to the internet platform, which is fundamentally private, because you can't have a First Amendment case against a private company. You're a lawyer. Give us your sense of this.
Let me answer that by taking stock of where we're at so far in the conversation, because Peter said something that I thought was really interesting as he declined ever so politely and diplomatically not to answer your question about what he would do if he were running PayPal. And all this gets back to Clay's point about Lieberman's intellectual honesty. He, in a way, gave you an intellectually honest answer, because the easy answer, especially given how the conversation is shaped up so far, would be like, if I were running PayPal today, I'd tell those feds to, soak their heads. Go drown a cat in the basement. Where did you get that, Clay? Anyway, but he didn't say that. What I heard between the lines of what he said was, so much of our actions are defined by the role that we are in. That we have a role that is distinct. We owe duties to people near us. And he says, I don't want to put too many words in your mouth, but if somebody's running a company, they are under extreme pressure. And it can be awfully hard to second guess them, at least in the say that I would do something different when they are confronted with, you name it, a Patriot Act Section 215 order that says, not only do you have to do this, but you can't tell anyone that we asked you to do it, and here's our badge. And if you're designing a system from the top, and that used to be what we thought constitutionalists did when they forged a constitution for a state, you want to try to design the system recognizing that people have to play their roles and that there are few outliers among them that will break out of the role and say, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do something else instead. And somehow try to set up the pieces so that the roles are arrayed, so that they are actually in healthy conflict, and that sometimes one side wins, sometimes the other side wins, and the good stuff comes out of this conflict if the pieces are set up right. That's the classic idea of separation of powers. It's also an understanding of the role of the media, which is why I think a lot of people, including in Congress right now, have a hard time thinking of WikiLeaks as media. And if you could flick the switch in their head, this might not be true of Lieberman since he wants to send the New York Times to jail too, but many others would say, I see, if they were media, then I would treat them differently. So a lot has to do with roles. And so far what I've heard from Daniel Ellsberg, this is somebody whose role has been in perceiving a great injustice being done and very little recourse through official channels to leak. And then later to have history's judgment that it turned out that was the right thing to do. And that's how I hear him saying that, somebody like that who not only leaked because he saw the injustice, but then had the President of the United States engaging in wiretaps and kind of talk about micromanagement of what's going on in the country. Of course your view is going to be not only I don't trust government, but the American government has really kind of let me down, might be part, to put it mildly, of his view. And of course, Peter's view as a libertarian, of course, after he's done saying what he's saying, and therefore the government should be smaller. Of course that will be his conclusion. That's his case to argue. So, all right, now let me circle around to your question by then taking on a role which is just to sort of prevent too much violent agreement among the panel here, so to play the role a little bit of the law professor. What I didn't hear from Daniel was an assertion that the government is not entitled to keep any secrets. And my guess is he wouldn't say that. What he said was he was against a hypothetical, not yet passed Official State Secrets Act that would immediately and without question criminalize anything leaked that had been marked as classified. But there are some classified things, whether they're nuclear codes or something else, that we would all get together and agree that should stay secret. If that's the case, I think the right question for all of us to ask is how do we want to set up the pieces on the board, knowing that there's been this huge sea change called the internet, for which it's much easier, and just generally technology, to take a thumb drive or a CD marked Lady Gaga, as was the case, and instead of it being Lady Gaga, it's all the secrets, thousands and thousands of cables, and just put it out there. What do we do about that? And one possibility is to say, as the government trying to be enlightened about it, we can still be against leaks. We can be ready to prosecute certain leakers, maybe even prosecute certain intermediaries. The difference, by the way, might be motive. If your motive is to inform the public, that might be okay. If your motive is to damage the government of the United States and bring it down because you hate it and you are its enemy, that might be a different motive. And in criminal law, motive can matter a lot. That's also, by the way, when you think about the difference between a leaker and a spy, because there's only been a few leakers that have been brought under this title, a leaker is a spy who shares the stuff with everyone. Spies are more selective with whom they share the leaks, right? You're only leaking it to Russia. If you leak it to Russia and everyone else at the same time, you're a leaker, not a spy. But of course, everybody's getting it. But the difference is motive. The spy has a motive only to help Russia. The leaker may have other motives. So I think we have a healthier ecosystem if it's not true that primary parts of it are so controlled by a certain handful of corporate choke points that they are then compelled to play their role. And we should expect at some point, even though part of our role will be to inveigh against them when they do play their role, to try to convince them maybe to be a little more free, we shouldn't have to have a system that depends on that level of response from companies. And you might see it consistent enough from company to company, and I think a libertarian could still accept players who are not governmental but not corporate in the classic sense either, that there's actually a role for .org. I would hope that the media sees its role as not simply corporate, to maximize its profits, and good stories do that. So thinking through ways in which we could set up a system so that people could, in the words of one of my student groups that just presented on this yesterday as part of a class we were doing, leak responsibly, which sounds like sort of a contradiction in terms, especially the likes of Joe Lieberman. But could you leak responsibly? Could you come up with a system that processes it so that we agree that maybe this should come to light, but there should be redactions to protect sources and methods? How can we build a system that will do that? And WikiLeaks itself maybe has slowly been pushed or co-opted into that direction. When they were first founded, the idea was send us the stuff, we'll send it out again. We're basically BitTorrent.
But that's more or less what happened this time. WikiLeaks, as Daniel pointed out, did not dump 250,000 cables.
That's what GZ is saying.
Yeah, but in spite of that, you still have Lieberman staff, and you still have Amazon responding. So the question is, how do you create a structure where there is a public space where a First Amendment right would actually apply on this platform that's privately owned?
Yes. And just to answer your question doctrinally, so I'm not dodging it, that wasn't a comment on you before. Now it was, but it wasn't meant to be. Clay mentioned the Pruneyard case. The antecedent case to that is called Marsh versus Alabama. It's a wonderfully brief, short case from 1943, I think, before they had word processors, so you couldn't copy and paste, really short. And it involved the Gulf Shipbuilding Company, which was a company town. And it was kicking people off the public squares of the company town because it owned the public squares too, and said, look, it's just trespass. And normally the First Amendment would back that up, back the company up and say it's not the government, it's a company. The First Amendment only applies against the government. And in Marsh v. Alabama, the unusual answer from the Supreme Court was at some point it walks and acts enough like a duck, and it's performing enough vital function. It's as if it's a state. It stands in the shoes of the state for First Amendment purposes. And the Gulf Shipbuilding Company can't bring a criminal trespass charge, even though the public square is private property, technically, against the Jehovah's Witness who was there. So there might be a remedy, either to say some private companies, in essence, are so much providing the sidewalks here that are normally public squares that a la Marsh v. Alabama, we will treat them that way. Only problem there is Marsh v. Alabama has not been followed since Marsh v. Alabama. Or to try to affirmatively construct the space so that you don't have a company town, so that there are corners where conversation can happen. And then it is the role of Joel Lieberman to try to persuade people and get on his pulpit and say, this would be wrong, please don't do it. But that's not bullying, that's just him as a public official expressing a view at that point.
Okay, Roy, do you want to do your 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions?
Yeah. All right, so I unfortunately am one of the few who is an executive chairman and has to balance the delicate positioning of our company and our views. And I have to say I was very intimidated by being on this panel with all five of you because you sort of know more. So I've been studying for the last 7 weeks in terror, Karen, trying to make sure I'm prepared for this. But I would say that there was a big moment. I was in India with our colleagues when the story broke. And there was 400 thought workers in a room in India, and there was silence when the story broke about Amazon. And it's quite different, the reaction outside of the United States than inside the United States towards this topic. I would say the majority, I had this wonderful letter from one of my colleagues, a Swiss woman developer, rather apolitical, saying, I'm so embarrassed by what America and Europe has done on this. It is if we don't think that this is a watershed moment for young people who have lived their life in the internet to see that the government and companies are colluding against something that they believe is their birthright, we are missing a major issue in how people emotionally, especially outside the United States, are reacting to this issue. But I want to start with a story real quick about 4 people who are heroes. And Peter Chase, their names are Peter Chase, George Christian, Janet Nosek, and Barbara Bailey. Any of you have heard of these people? Okay, everybody ought to know of them. Now, I know in the tech sector we like to call ourselves geeks, but there actually are other professions where you have geeks like Peter. And librarians happen to be one of those. And they're 4 rather quaint librarians, these 4 people. And they don't like your coffee shop, mug in the library. They actually have this quaint view that librarians ought to serve the pillars of democracy. And what happened to these people was that they were the recipients of a national security letter, which is an unbelievable, talking about thing I agree with Peter. Here is a letter that the federal government, the FBI, can issue without a warrant, without a judge, without any process, and it comes with an even more Orwellian feature called a gag order that is for life, that you can't talk to your wife. These 4 people who decided to take on the role of fighting against the state, 4 librarians against the state of the United States, they had to lie to their children about the existence of this gag order, right? This gag order doesn't say you can't talk about the substance of the order. It says you can't talk about the gag order. And this actually was these people wanted to testify in Congress against the Patriot Act reenactment because they were saying this is a draconian measure of the government, and they couldn't testify because they would have had to admit that they were these people. So hundreds of thousands of these national security letters were issued between 2003 and 2006. It's become sort of, important to read the Constitution at every meeting nowadays. So I want to read real quickly the 4th Amendment for those of you who might have forgotten it. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. There is nothing further from the 4th Amendment than a national security letter and the power that it's giving the government. And again, the Orwellian nature of this gag order, for those of you who believe in 1st and 4th Amendment rights, the idea that you cannot tell your neighbors about these things, in my mind, is a prima facie case of an attack on these amendments. So what did these 4 librarians do? They launched a 1-year case against the government. They were known, in their circles as John Doe. Eventually, the good news is they did allow themselves, they became the first 4 Americans who could admit that they had received a national security letter. When the FBI Inspector General looked at these cases, massive use of abuse, and the fact was 52% of them were against American citizens. So my question to us as technical people in the room, where are the librarians in the tech industry? Where are they? Where is Peter Chase and Janet Nosek in this room? I view I would say in my life, I have to admit, I've learned more in the last 7 weeks about the question of these issues. But I want to call out for us, because we are the tech sector, 2 companies that I did think the opposite of what the cowardliness of Amazon. One of them is Zipwire in Philadelphia. They supported the right of WikiLeaks to receive money and allowed the American citizens to exercise their right to dissent. And the second company was a Canadian company, which was the DNS provider. Going back to your point, about the question of DNS providing. You pull somebody's DNS registration off, that's like, if that isn't a public service, I don't know what is. And so here was this Canadian company that, EasyDNS, which came in and provided the DNS providing service, a massive service, to this person. There are 2 other actors that I wanted to mention. Some of them are in this room, and one of the most important cases was Yahoo successfully rejecting the Justice Department's ludicrous argument that if you've read your email, the government doesn't need a warrant to read it. So thank you, Yahoos in the room, for a very important case for protecting the right for my read emails to be read by others. The second measure is for Twitter in their negotiating with the Justice Department around, this was actually not an NSL, it was, I think, a 2073D. Yes, I've been trained now. That's what these things are. And here was, but the thing, it also had a gag order. But what Twitter did was they negotiated against the gag order, which is why Brigitte Jonsdottir was allowed to then release the subpoena, which I read was quoted. Most of the people in this room probably remember, under the helpful eye of Peter Klein, an AT&T person, that on 611 Folsom Street in San Francisco, going back to these the warrantless wiretaps, secret rooms being built in there to allow NSA to billions of bits of information. These were not telephone conversations. These were internet communications, not only of AT&T, but 15 other providers. My second question for the people in this audience: what is the mathematical chance that these rooms do not exist at Facebook and Google? How do we know that Yahoo and there aren't members in this audience who are in the same compromised position as the librarians who have these gag orders? It is inconceivable to me that such rooms or such kind of activities don't exist. I think we've tried to talk about, one of the things we've discussed is what are the values and principles that as the internet community we ought to try and protect. So we've sort of come up with 3 quick ones, or 4. One, and I think, Peter, you and I would agree with this is where the people of this, the existence of a free and transparent internet has actually been one of the most democratic things that has come across in human history. The fact that the barrier to entry, that somebody with a cell phone in Alabama or Zimbabwe has access to the internet, this is one of the most profound leveling events in human history. And if we don't protect that thing that we have built so hard to cherish, we have failed our children. The freedom of the press should not be restricted to the New York Times, but has to include WikiLeaks. We don't fight that. We are giving up on 200 years of the rights that we have fought to protect for the freedom of the press. I believe that if you read the subpoena that was sent to Twitter, you could interpret that as asking for all the IP addresses of all the WikiLeaks viewers. Do you really think that the US government should know the IP addresses of 600,000 people who follow WikiLeaks? I find that a terrifying infringement on the right to association. The fourth principle that I think emerges is that the criticism of the government is the core of the First Amendment. And if anybody's under doubt, why is the US government going so vitriolically after WikiLeaks? They are obviously embarrassed about the war crimes and war difficulties that happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's not pretend there's just not that issue gets swept under the rug. There's something that was wrong, and that has been brought to light, and thank goodness for WikiLeaks. So I would say one thing as a business person. I spend a lot of my time traveling, almost 300 days a year, a lot of it outside the US, probably 70% of our staff are outside the US. I have a Canadian client who I was talking to about 2 weeks after this event, and I asked her, what do you think of the Amazon case? And she said, Roy, I told you before, as a Canadian, I will never consider allowing my Canadian company to host with an American provider, knowing that my customer records can be followed by a foreign government and a foreign country, and I have violated my oath as a corporate officer to protect the privacy of my customers.
Yeah, just want the Australians to do it in Canada.
Right, exactly. Exactly. But by the way, and I think the guy from Fujitsu said the same thing. What Amazon has done has basically set back the cloud movement. It has. Oh, yeah? Because it is totally said, forget the political side. If I have a Brazilian colleague who was thinking about a startup, and he called me about a week after this, and he was talking about who should he host with. And I said to him, no, why would you consider an American hoster when you have a great company like Local Web in Brazil? I think the American audience does not understand that this has great international ramifications way beyond what we think. And so I agree with Clay completely. I believe we are at an inflection point for the freedom of expression. We either fight now, and I wanted to close with President Madison. This is, I think, a great quote. You've probably heard this. Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of freedoms of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. James Madison. That, in my mind, is where we stand at the moment.
I do want to voice a bit of a I'm not sure, dissenting view here, but I think it is, I think all these things do come down to a lot of details. And this sounds, great as a speech. Your speech sounded great, Jonathan.
Why don't I feel complimented?
And your speech sounded great. And
why do I not feel comfortable?
at the same time, there are all these questions about the details of how these things get done. And so, do you think Facebook should have been created by Harvard University? It tried as a public service, and it was not able to get the UI right in any way that was remotely.
I think
made
Harvard's
sense.
taking credit for Facebook these days.
I agree, but the history is, as you know, is contested in various ways, and Harvard University probably did a better job than if we had the U.S. government or community or something like that created. And so I do think one of the things that's tricky about media, both old media and new media, is that they're not just public services. You also have to try to run them as businesses in ways that are actually quite functional. And this tends to get lost in these sorts of discussions.
Does that mean there needs to be a different public space where First Amendment rights govern?
I think it comes back to government versus corporate power. I don't think you do it by regulating corporations even more, which I think is the practical upshot of what you would end up proposing.
But this is your devil in the details thing, because you push in one place and something does come out the other side. I mean, we can try to say that the corporations are the right haven when the governments are all pissed off about something and trying to, squelch dissent. All right, let the corporations host it or something. But then there's going to be something that the corporations are doing that might not be so savory. And the government wants to come in and help. I don't know. Suppose there were an oil rig somewhere. It's like, well, I don't want it regulated. From now on, if I am purchasing an oil rig, I am not going to use whoever BP's subcontractor was.
I don't think there was an official Secrecy Act with British Petroleum. I think it was quite transparent what happened.
The system worked.
It was not like,
just ask the fish.
Well, it was not a nuclear. It was not quite like the kinds of things that we have that we were discussing.
So at least we can agree that not only nuclear code should be secret, but nuclear plants can be regulated, but not oil platforms.
No, what we're saying is that what I would submit to you is that there is, that there is vastly more potential for abuse by governments. They kill more people than corporations do.
But talk about a crazy equation. That's an answer to a question that is extremely vague. Who should I fear more, corporations or the government? I just want to get my fears in order.
Well, I think. Let me answer your question. I think governments kill more people than corporations. This is not a vague claim.
But again, we're answering a question that's just like, as I'm trembling in fear.
But this is irrelevant. But it is worth getting an answer to that question. It's not worth saying that you're trembling in fear so much that you're not going to try to answer the question. Answer the question. How many people get killed by governments?
Peter.
How many get killed by corporations? No, I want an answer to the question.
Well, I believe in joint and several liability.
No, that's an
It takes a village to kill a child.
That's not true, and that's an evasion. And
no, because
actually, it doesn't take a whole village to kill a child.
You could ask the same thing about war. And war, as Dwight Eisenhower would tell us, is an amazing collaboration between various sectors to produce the armaments, the bombs that drop. But let's suppose I concede your point, and I say, look, if I really had to choose, of course, the government is the one with the most guns, and that's a reason to fear.
And that's why there's an asymmetry.
Yes,
and you want to have.
I'm with you
it's
on
more
that.
important for there to be transparency into governments than into individuals or corporations.
But the details, and I'll make this quick though. The details say there are reasons then why the government, say in America, has earned itself multiple amendments in the Bill of Rights that only apply to it, which has been your continuing point. Because there is a special threat from the government because of its monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And that's all true. But it doesn't mean that there aren't other problems for which the government is actually a helpful player to try to solve.
Well, to
point out that it can be bad over here doesn't mean it can't be helpful over here.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. Yeah. This was just too good to jump in earlier.
We were about to settle the problem of libertarianism.
But But I want to leave some time for some questions, and if you want them to go back at it, just ask them the question. So who's first?
I'm very surprised.
This is Mike Gravel, Portland Senator.
I'm very surprised that you take at face value that one senator could bully Amazon. It's truly ridiculous. Supposing Senator Conrad had made the same statement, do you think that Amazon would have backed down? No. It's the code in the system that Lieberman speaks for AIPAC and Israel. And so is Amazon more afraid of the government than they are of AIPAC, would be the question I would raise. And that's something you haven't touched on at all, because that's what's underlying it all. And I can tell you, there's no way one senator can have that much power individually, I don't care what chairman of what committee, because to act, he has to get something passed into law. And it says something that in the Congress, not one member stood up to defend or challenge Lieberman. Why? Because they are also beholden to AIPAC. And so the question I have is, what's your comment about AIPAC's influence on corporate America and Silicon Valley?
Well, I mean, that's a whole evening. I have to say that just on this, I want to just say one thing. I mean, in terms of what's been released so far, Israel, and if you read the Jerusalem Post, were not perturbed. The editorials in Haaretz and Jerusalem Post were, we thought we were going to get it, and we didn't. So I don't know how this direct connection with Lieberman and AIPAC would have shown up in this particular instance. That being said, does anyone want to take a crack at this?
I do agree that it's not Lieberman. I also think that, let's face it, the mood of the country right now, when you have people saying, let's assassinate people, these are national secrets, no business person wants to be perceived as not patriotic, right, beyond Lieberman. I don't necessarily know that it was actually Lieberman. I don't know, because all of us are speculating. It wouldn't surprise me if some marketing people were saying, you know what, we have more American customers than we do outside the U.S. This is viewed as an issue that is going to get us in trouble with Americans. We need to be seen as being, so I'm not convinced. I agree with you. I don't know that it was just one senator calling that actually had this impact. So I suspect the broader issue, it goes back to what I was trying to get at. I agree that the government is dangerous.
We don't actually agree. We shouldn't gloss over our disagreements.
The what? On which one?
Well, anyway, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
All right.
Go ahead.
No, but my point, my only point is that the real substantive issue is there was no redress, right, easily for these companies. And if everybody's, my disagreement, where I think I do disagree with Peter, is if in fact everybody eventually folds, as Peter suggests they might, then there is no redress for protection of private citizens and the First Amendment and the press. And I'm sorry, the libertarians don't have an answer for that, in my opinion.
Okay, next question.
Can I just say,
yeah, go ahead.
Jump in quickly on this. I think there's almost a question echoing around, including down to the one we were just asked, which is, if your view is that the system is just basically corrupt down to the root, and just, you flick the bark on the tree and it's about to fall over, Soviet Union, dry rot inside kind of thing. If that is your view, then you may have one particular set of conclusions that follow about how appropriate or how much history will vindicate, say, the indiscriminate leaking of documents from the government in question. You're going to have one view if you actually think it is so corrupt that the existing avenues set up within the system for redress of grievances are themselves all foreclosed. And at that point, you kind of do the Hail Mary pass that says, yep, I'm going to take a thumb drive. I haven't had time to read these cables. Let someone else do it. Here, Julian, you look like a good guy. Why don't you look at it? That is one outcome. And I've heard, in many ways, I agree with some of your points about the ways in which we've had too much of a push, thanks to fear, towards sort of a national security state we don't want. And there are many people within the state, that national security state, charged with making it happen, who have their own qualms about it and have made their views known. If you don't think it's gone that far, and I got to say, to me, your question comes off as paranoid. That's just how it sounds to me. If I believed your premise,
hang on. If you say that, I got to go back to Mike Gravel, and he's got to be able to respond. And
Sure,
I'm more than happy to do that.
No, no.
In fact, I invite you to the Real News Network, and we will have this full conversation.
But
you can't go after him now. And
I'm just saying to my ear how it sounded. I'm not meaning to. That was not a substantive rebuttal of your accusation.
Right.
No, but you can't say that without him being able to respond. So I'm going to respond. Which is next question, please.
That's right.
My question is, take somebody like Visa. They're not allowed to discriminate against women charities. They're not allowed to discriminate against black charities. They're not allowed to discriminate against people who want to contribute to the Republican Party. Why are they allowed to discriminate against the WikiLeaks charity? Why do they have this power?
Who wants to take that on?
You're the lawyer.
If I don't want to answer the question, all I have to do is say you're paranoid. But I haven't said that.
Thank you.
One interesting thing about the question is it sort of presumes American law is what we're talking about. And that gets a little bit to Clay's point about international and global and such. And of course, Visa is a global concern. It's used around the world. But one of the lines it knows it can't cross is within the American law framework. And you're right that certain things that would amount to discrimination on the basis of race or gender are specifically prohibited by federal law and anchored in the Constitution. But aside from those few handful of red lines, I think actually, unless somehow it's an antitrust issue or we get to Marsh v. Alabama again, if Visa decides they don't want to process any payments to any company beginning with W, they're entitled to do it. They don't want to give it to Republicans, they're entitled to do it. But of course, they might not do that because that's going to cost them money. So, I mean, this ultimately gets back to the question, what would make them not process it for WikiLeaks? That the idea that they don't want their business disrupted, either by a regulatory intervention or by a boycott of Americans that think what they're doing is not patriotic. It's a business decision on their part. And one would just hope that there aren't just a handful of points of control, either because of public pressure or because of government intervention, that for certain vital things, and I don't know, movement of money is pretty vital. Even more vital is movement of bits. That for the movement of bits, we shouldn't let the passions of any one moment or the acts of any one entity be too easily able to shut down speech. I agree with that.
Next question. Go ahead.
Hi. Hello there. I'm Anthony Moore. I'm at Yahoo. I'm managing editor there. I also serve on the board of directors of the Online News Association and the American Society of News Editors. And for years, both organizations worked assiduously for a shield law. And we were within a hair's breadth of actually getting that last summer. Well, of course, you know, opinions may differ as to whether or not it would have passed. But let me just say that it was our belief that we were very close to achieving that goal. And so WikiLeaks happened, and you know, nothing's going to happen on that front in the future. So first question I have, and it's pretty clear Clay's got an answer to this, is does it matter to you? Would a shield law matter in this context? And the second question I have is about whether or not WikiLeaks itself and the WikiLeaks Act was an act of journalism. It's clear it was an act of speech, but was it an act of journalism? And as we move to a digital age, are we going to consider openness and information dumps and transparency of information to be equivalent to journalism, or is there a fundamental difference that might trigger something like a shield law to be necessary?
Clay.
Yeah, I think, and I had been saying for years that there wouldn't be a shield law because the definition of journalism as it was previously constructed was incoherent. There was no way a law could be written around the idea, because journalists were previously, when you look at the state shield laws, they were previously defined as people employed by publishers to do that thing. And there were so few publishers that you could just enumerate the publishers. There was never a definition of journalism as an activity. They were instead treated as a professional class who had access to the means of making things public by virtue of working for publishers. The means of making things public, having become essentially the birthright of anybody who's got access to the network, suddenly stopped being definitional. And so there is this story going around about the shield law that WikiLeaks has been a recent surprising event. and that's 3 lies in one sentence. Right? It hasn't been recent, it hasn't been surprising, and it's not an event, right? This is a deep change in the way information is distributed. It has been obvious since Brad Templeton launched Clarinet in 1988 what the change in the digital shift to journalism meant for the traditional practice of it. And WikiLeaks isn't an event, it's a demonstration of capability, right? If it goes away tomorrow and Julian is somehow put in some place where he could never speak in public again, the basic capability is still there. So while WikiLeaks, I think, dramatized the inability to draft a shield law as a local ordinance, the basic tension between what Congress thought they were working on, that shield law, and what the network actually makes possible has been there for decades. So I think the only thing that's recent is Congress's recognition that there's no current definition of journalism that they can enact that will hold up in an environment where anyone can make anything public. So I think the shield law was always going to fail. I think it was a Zeno's paradox. It was illusory that it was days away, because as long as it didn't happen, it hadn't happened. And I think there would always have been some event where people realized we can't actually enact this thing because it's based on essentially 20th century assumptions. They're trying to essentially take the 49 state shield laws and ratify them at the federal level. To the question of whether or not WikiLeaks is journalism, that is ultimately not a sort of strong ontological question where there is a thing called journalism and we can hold it up and look at WikiLeaks and check the two against each other. It really is about our evolving sense of what the media environment is. So I'd say it's indeterminate until people decide. But the one thing I think that is clear is that WikiLeaks is a media outlet. In as much as media means the middle layer, WikiLeaks is as much that as any other actor in the system. And the fact that WikiLeaks has not, in fact, engaged in a discriminate data dump. Glenn Greenwald of Salon, his head has been popping off about 3 times a day, going after the press saying, oh, but Assange just dumped 250,000 cables out into the public sphere, and he didn't do that thing. And I think, in fact, the specific bolting on of that corpus of material to editorial judgment at Pais and I forget which the German paper was, New York Times, regarding Der Spiegel, thank you, says that it is a media outlet that is part of the journalistic ecosystem. Further than that, I think we can't go, but those two things I think have already clearly been demonstrated by the landscape.
So we are supposedly ending now, but my sense of it, am I right? We don't want to end yet. Am I right about this? Okay. So we're going to go a little bit longer. Where is the next question coming from? Over here, go ahead.
I'm Joyce Cordy. I come from a long tradition of management consulting.
Maybe you could put the mic a little closer.
Okay. I'm Joyce Cordy. I come from a long tradition of management consulting in this valley. And now I run a blog called Reimagine America, which is about the business of government rather than the process of politicking. But I'm also Jewish. My parents were the only survivors of 2 very big German families. I just heard something I find so incredibly frightening. By the way, Gabriel Giffords is also a practicing Jew. I find it extremely frightening that the group of you, while I agree with many of your premises about the freedom of press, and I also have some questions about data security within the government, I find it outrageous that you will sit there and allow someone to claim that Lieberman is, one, the officer of a foreign government, and that this is a Jewish cabal.
No, but
my
first of all,
family
nobody just sat here. What I said was, this is a topic that needs real conversation and debate, and that isn't the topic for tonight. That's what I said.
Well, in 1938, that's what they said in Vienna.
I don't think they offered to do a show on it in Vienna in 1938, which is what I'm saying we're going to do.
The rest of it you can read in the Holocaust Museum. But You know, I just find that it's incredible that a room full of people here in California, many of you natives like me, would listen to that statement and find that okay.
Okay, next question.
Larry Magid, CBS News. I have some friends at the State Department who are very concerned about what WikiLeaks means to their profession, how they go forward. No, I mean, you can laugh about it, but, you know, it's very fashionable to honor our servicemen and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, these are patriotic Americans who are trying to do their job. And so the question I was trying to ask for my very young friend at the State Department, who's very worried about going forward, how is he going to be able to conduct State Department business? How is he going to be able to brief his superiors on how foreign leaders ought to be treated? And I think it's a legitimate question in this era of WikiLeaks.
Well, I'll paraphrase it and just give a quick answer, and then I'll give it to Daniel, maybe. Just in terms of facts, this WikiLeaks was a release primarily from the CEPRnet, which was essentially the internet for the government, especially for the State Department, that was then opened up to the military. Apparently, as many as 2.5 million people have access to CEPRnet. So one would think, if you really wanted to keep a secret, maybe you don't put it somewhere where 2.5 million people can get at it. The second thing is there is another network, which is for top secret, where the real conversations go on, the real classified conversations go on. So, and structurally, I think there is structure for that to happen. But are you saying they're questioning that there shouldn't be whistleblowing?
No, of course not. But I'm actually wondering, first of all, whether WikiLeaks is into the State Department as Napster was in the music industry, which wasn't all bad, because out of Napster and the collapse of the music industry as we know it is emerging a different kind of music industry. So part of the question, or the follow-up, I guess, is what, when I say what did this mean for the State Department, could it mean a new type of diplomacy that will have a little more light of day?
I cannot stop myself from saying you mean actually doing privately what they say they're doing publicly. But I'm the moderator. I'm not supposed to make cracks. Daniel,
I'm not...
how does this affect the ability of the State Department to do its work, not knowing when something might go public? How do you have what they would think is necessary confidential conversations?
I think it's very striking that of the possibly hundreds of thousands and possibly more than that, hundreds of millions, who had access to the CEPRnet and who saw the kinds of things that Bradley Manning saw. For example, to start with, the Apache helicopter, which was put on the video, which if you haven't seen it is worth seeing, by WikiLeaks with the editorial comment, the headline, Collateral Murder, which I thought was a rather well-chosen title. I say that as a former Marine infantry officer who has instructed on the laws of war to my battalion, as battalion training officer, and to my platoons. It was very clear to me watching that video that Private Bradley Manning was correct when he looked at that and saw murder. Most killing in war, a lot of killing in war is not murder. Some killing in war is murder. What was on that video was murder. And he was the one who decided that it needed putting out. Earlier, he had informed his superior that men that he had collected as part of his job as an intelligence enlisted man was to pull in suspects and give them over to Iraqis whom he realized and knew, and his superior knew, were to be tortured, a clear war crime, for us to turn it over. The Iraqis were also committing a war crime, but for me to do that, for us to do that, knowing that they were to be tortured, is a clear crime. And moreover, it was accompanied as the cables which someone, and let's say Bradley Manning, he's the suspect here, turned over. Every time that was reported by Americans, we are handing people over who have been tortured or will be tortured or are being tortured. The order was accompanied by a superior officer saying, do not investigate further. That's a blatantly illegal order under the Nuremberg principles to be disobeyed if you knew the law. Most of them probably didn't know the law, but the law is, under our international obligations, it's a law that we must investigate any credible accusation of torture. WikiLeaks has now produced, thanks to someone, let's say Bradley Manning, an enormous amount of documentary evidence now that that illegal order was given, that no one exposed it except one, Bradley Manning, the one person who obeyed the law, I would say, on that case. and that no one's investigated. As far as we know, it has not been investigated in the while that has been out by the Obama administration. Now, as Commander-in-Chief, Obama bears ultimate authority, responsibility for those criminal actions. So, by the way, the one difference from the Pentagon Papers is the Pentagon Papers, which were about previous administrations when they came under Nixon, did not incriminate anyone in the Nixon administration. Actually, they didn't incriminate even people in the Democratic. They showed high-level reckless decision-making and deception, but not clear criminality. Actually, I could give other examples. These documents do involve clear-cut criminality, so I think the sensitivity, let me come back, sensitivity of this administration to that is, can be explained. But the something I would like to turn, though, before we end, I thought that Roy here made not only a profound statement, and I really appreciate being able to hear that, and I want to get your notes, but also a very unusual probing challenge to the businessmen, the corporate people and publishers and whatnot in this audience. It's a very select audience. And I know that his intention was not, you people are complicit, you people are to be blamed in some way, but rather a challenge. You're on the spot. You are facing a challenge at this moment of profound implications for our democracy. And I would like to follow up some of the comments that have been made here on corporate government collaboration, often necessary, important, including keeping some secrets, which, as you said, I certainly agree. There are secrets that should be kept. But the FBI, the NSA, the government, the executive branch, has two responsibilities in this area where they would like corporate collaboration. One, they would like total transparency of the public, of the citizens, of their private lives. They can't have too much information. They cannot have too much information about that. And for a lot of reasons, which I could go into, not just for prosecution, not just for whatnot, but for manipulation, for choosing their policies, for one gigantic focus group. But above all, how many of you here have seen the movie The Lives of Others? Which was, how many have not seen that? An Academy Award movie for foreign film about 4 or 5 years ago about the Stasi, S-T-A-S-I, the secret police of the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. And their motto at the epigraph at the beginning of the film is, aim of the Stasi, to know everything. Now, when NSA, a government organ, set out under orders to listen in to domestic conversations on September 12th, 2001, clearly illegal, clearly unconstitutional, but they all did it, and there were no leaks for years and years on that subject. They were using a technology which a lot of you people helped. Well, no, this is telephone technology. You were involved in telephone. Two things here, which the Stasi couldn't dream of, that kind of access. Went beyond what and let me mention one thing the Stasi needed, which shows in that movie. There's a lot of information that isn't said on the phone, that isn't said anywhere but in bed, or to a relative, or to the closest friend, orally, maybe in the forest. How do they get to that, to know everything? Well, the film shows very clearly. They blackmail the people from information they've gotten from the wiretaps and say, if your daughter wants to go to college, if you don't want this, if you want that, it's what they want, knowing what they want and what they fear, you better cooperate with us to get the information that isn't written down, that isn't on the tins. In other words, to make a nation of informants, which is what the GDR was, a nation of informants, even beyond what Stalin had achieved in Russia. Now, we now know that it wasn't just NSA who was listening to all that. It was all the telephone, not quite all the telephone companies. One of them, remember, resisted and got punished for it. But AT&T and the others all cooperated. Now, the other thing that the government wants is total, if possible, opacity of their own operations. That the government should know, not total, but the public should know only what they want them to know, only what they permit them to know, true or false, whether it's true or false, but that they control everything else. Okay, what we've been hearing about here, to some extent, is something a little new, private corporations helping maintain that opacity. How? because WikiLeaks comes along using your technology and the technology to increase transparency of government, unauthorized. They don't want that. Total transparency? No, that is a straw man, totally straw man. I'm not in favor of it. The government needs some secrecy, deserves some privacy. Assange has said the same thing to me. I said, do you believe in total transparency? He said, that's absurd. Of course not. And as is shown by his actions, he has 251,000 state cables. He has released on his website about 1,900 chosen by the press. Now, see, he's given them editorial control in effect. He has released less than 1% of what he has and what someone, maybe Bradley Manning, gave him. That's very discriminate. It's less than 1%, and the choice has been made by the newspapers. But it's more than they want, than the government wants. So how to shut him down? Well, as I said, they have a problem with prosecution, though they may surmount that and take their chances on unconstitutional. But short of that, get Amazon to cut off their funding, get PayPal to cut off their funding, get other people in on the act, help these corporations now extra legally helping the government stop a transparent move. While on the other hand, one last point, on Zuckerberg's Person of the Year account in Time magazine, I just looked it up. If you look at that plus the runner-up, who was Assange, actually had more votes from the readers. These are two people who both talk about transparency. It runs through the articles totally. Assange is talking about transparency, greater transparency, not total, of the government. You'll never have a lot of transparency, but he wants more. Zuckerberg is in favor of voluntary transparency, no real limits. And he says he has a blind spot on privacy. And really, total transparency of the public is not impossible. Now, that article in Time started with this anecdote. They're sitting in their transparent cubicle, in their open space in Facebook, and who bursts in but one man? I thought I'd be the only man with a tie on tonight, but like Robert Mueller was the one man in the room with a tie on, and he was older in a suit, and he comes in and he says, I was just in the building and I wanted to say hello to Mark Zuckerberg. So he says hello to Mark Zuckerberg, a little chit-chat, and then he leaves, and everybody's saying, what the hell was that? Now, nobody asks the question, why was Mueller in the building? He's the head of the FBI. Who was he seeing in the building? To what effect? The question didn't seem to be asked, including in the transparent, but later in the article, which has some interesting questions in it, makes the following point. Google, Facebook, Twitter, but they're talking about Facebook, have an unparalleled database about the desires, the likes, the preferences, the values, everything else of people in the world, including the US, bigger than the FBI, they asserted. They said, Mueller is lusting after, is very anxious to get that, and will come with subpoenas. Have they come with a subpoena to Facebook? We know they have, in effect, to Twitter. Roy asked the question. You gave an answer. You think they have, in effect, or maybe more than a subpoena. Do they need a subpoena? How closely are they working? This transparency, which bonds us together and gives us all so many friends that we didn't know before, but all these friends that are connected, gives the state an absolutely unparalleled in the history of humanity ability to know what's going on in its citizens, to find out who the dissenters are within the government. A leak I would like to see is from NSA, inside, absolutely opaque on this to Congress. How many congresspersons have you listened to in the last 10 years? How many sources? How many newsmen? We don't know anything of what NSA, they absolutely refuse to tell Congress. But it's not just NSA. The telephone companies were shielded. Now they're practically part of the government. Obama voted as a senator for immunity for the telephone companies from their dealings with the government. So they have this cloak of invisibility as government entities. Now that's for telephones. Okay, how about, as you said, how about for Facebook, Google, Twitter, put them all together if they're all working together, their ability to manipulate us, to know this, is absolutely antithetical to democracy, and together they could form the United Stasi of America. And I don't want that, and I think the challenge you made was people in this audience have the ability to decide that they are ready to take a risk in their lives to fight to preserve democracy in this country and to preserve us from total transparency to our executive branch.
So I think that will be the last word for tonight, except let me just add one thing. There's another place, and this is not to mitigate in any way what Daniel just said, but there is a place in this world where the government had such knowledge, and the president of that place is now sitting in Saudi Arabia, and that's Tunisia. So they may also... it's not that people don't have a choice here, I think, and I think so. I don't think we should leave here thinking that because they know everything, we can do nothing. There's lots that can be done. And thank you very much for the Churchill Club for organizing this tonight. And let me also, I want to also thank ThoughtWorks again, because ThoughtWorks didn't just help pay the bill for this, but so many of their people put in so many hours to help book the panel and research and create this event. So ThoughtWorks really deserves something special tonight. And I think I'm wrapping up, but I'm not supposed to. You go.
You are wrapping up, and that's fine. But I also want to wrap up by saying, Jonathan, Peter, Roy, Clay, Dan, and Paul, thank you so much for authentically and honestly, each of you, sharing your perspectives with us tonight. This has been a deeply important discussion, we believe, and I hope that all of us in the audience will go on to build upon what we've heard, what we've learned, and what we've felt, to explore where we stand and what we stand for as individuals, as professionals, and as citizens. And I think understanding that within ourselves is an excellent start.
Harry, can I make a last-minute sponsor? It's actually for the cause. I forgot to mention this earlier. We have created an email address at ThoughtWorks called DFI, Defend the Free Internet at ThoughtWorks. Any companies that want to work with us on lobbying, supporting wonderful organizations like the CCR, ACLU, and EEF, please join us. So DFI at ThoughtWorks, please email us and we will get back to you.
And I have one more, which is, in order to allow more questions and more interaction with the panelists, we're going to rerun this on the Real News Network sometime soon. We'll let everyone know, and we're going to invite as many panelists as can to come in a live way so that you can keep questioning, and we'll keep this discussion going on what we hope is a free internet.
And I heard that there are over 18,000 watching on the Real News, most of them on the East Coast tonight. So as a gesture of our thanks, we would like to present you with our Churchill Club T-shirt.
Oh, thank you.
Please wear it proudly. Thanks again to our amazing... Thank you again to our amazing program sponsor, ThoughtWorks. And thank all of you for coming. Have a wonderful evening.